Hello, I'm Epic Treatise and welcome back to my channel. Today we're looking at a video from the channel Survive the Jive. Tom Rowsell, the creator, appears to be very angry at the BBC for pointing out that there were Africans in Britain before the 1960s. Let's take a look.
Welcome to Survive the Jive. I'm Tom Rowsell. I'm an historian.
Okay, so Rowsell says he's an historian and his LinkedIn says he has an MA from University College London. So we're going to take that claim seriously. That has a number of important implications. If he is an historian, there is a certain base level of knowledge and interpretation that we can expect him to employ. Thus, if he makes basic factual and interpretive errors, then we can only come to the conclusion that he is deliberately lying to his audience. Let's see if that happens, shall we?
And today I'm going to debunk Children's BBC, who have created a song for their Horrible Histories programme about 2 years ago on their YouTube channel called Been Here From the Start, which makes a number of egregious false claims about the history of Britain, trying to depict it as a place in which sub-Saharan African people have always played a significant and important part and have always been present.
So to start, he's slightly modified the egregious claims made in the song. He says the song claims that sub-Saharan Africans have always been present in England and have played a significant and important part. What the song actually says is that black people have always been here and have always played their part. So he's done something quite interesting. He's interpreted black to mean strictly sub-Saharan African, and we'll get back to that later. But he's also said played their part means they had a significant and important impact. Now, if I'm in a group of 1,000 people pulling a rope, and I add 0.1% of the pulling force, I've played my part, right? But I haven't done a significant or important part by any stretch of the imagination. In British English, and I can't speak for the rest of the Anglophone world, but this is from the BBC and Rowsell is English, so I'm on safe ground here. In British English, play my part is used to denote a part that, although small, is not so low as to be beyond notice, or indeed criticism. So just as a completely random example, if I were to say that a YouTube video I watched seemed to be motivated by petty racism and nationalistic tribalism, though male insecurity may also have played a part, what I mean is that nationalistic tribalism and racism are the primary motivators, but the creator may also be influenced to a lesser extent by their masculine insecurity. That's just an off-the-cuff example. Note, Rowsell doesn't play the song here or put up the lyrics, because he has to read the lyrics against their normal idiomatic usage, and so allow himself to be incredulous about its egregious claims.
I'll debunk each of the false claims today. After the first chorus, which is awful, there is a verse which claims that the Mesolithic population of Britain, typified by the example everyone knows, Cheddar Man, who is in fact a member of a race that was found all across Western Europe, from Sweden to Spain, which is known by geneticists as the Western hunter-gatherers. They were not black. They were not even related to African people today, sub-Saharan African people in any way.
None of that is true. Cheddar Man's DNA was extracted during a project at the National History Museum. They conducted analysis of the alleles that govern skin tone in humans and found that the recovered alleles placed him in all likelihood in the two darkest of the standard 5 human colour tones and precluded him from being in the lightest 2. This is actually not news and had already been shown for other members of the Western hunter-gatherer people, who absolutely did have dark skin, by the way. Take a look at Olalde et al. In Nature 507, Gamba et al. In Nature Communications 5, and Jones et al. In Nature Communications 6, if you're interested in that research. There has been some commentary that their results have been in doubt because this was, of course, a probabilistic analysis. But the fact is that the Natural History Museum study didn't prove that the Western hunter-gatherers had dark skin. It just proved that Cheddar Man was genetically a part of the Western hunter-gatherer group. We already knew that they had dark to black skin. As to not being related to modern sub-Saharan Africans, well, that's true in the sense that The Western hunter-gatherers stayed in northwest Europe and didn't return to Africa. They make up about 10% of the modern British genome, but they're still related to sub-Saharan Africans because we all are. All humans are descended from sub-Saharan Africans, and we are distant cousins to sub-Saharan Africans. Just because a population leaves a place and then doesn't interbreed with that population again, doesn't mean they're not related. I'm not unrelated to my cousins because I live in a different country to them. I'm not going to say he's lying here because he's an historian and this is prehistory, so I'm just going to say that he's simply wrong. All the literature is against him here. By the way, I'm cutting out a section here because he spends ages explaining the evidence that the Western hunter-gatherers are morphologically and genetically the ancestors of modern Europeans, as if that somehow proves they weren't dark-skinned. Yes, after our species grew up in East Africa, the people who lived in Northern Europe left around 60,000 years ago, and we basically didn't go back until the colonial period. That doesn't make Western hunter-gatherers or us unrelated to Africans.
However, even if they were dark-skinned, it doesn't make any difference because they are not sub-Saharan African blacks. Nelson Mandela is called black because he is sub-Saharan African. He doesn't actually have black skin. He's quite light-skinned, but he's still called black.
Okay, first thing, anyone else find it weird that he's discussing Nelson Mandela in the present tense? He knows Mandela's dead, right? Second thing, Western hunter-gatherers weren't living in sub-Saharan Africa, but that doesn't mean they didn't have dark skin. Again, all the peer-reviewed research on this topic shows that they did. Check out the Natural History Museum page on the Cheddaman Project. It's got a good bibliography on this topic.
Tamils from South Asia have very dark skin, but they're not called black because they are not from sub-Saharan Africa.
So this is a really interesting point. Why have we traditionally grouped sub-Saharan Africans into the category black and not other people with equally dark, if not darker, skin? Sub-Saharan Africa is incredibly culturally, tribally, linguistically, religiously, and genetically diverse. In fact, Sub-Saharan Africa is far more genetically diverse than the rest of the world. All extra-African gene pools nest within an African clade. If you, like me, are not African, then you are genetically more closely related to some Africans than those Africans would be to some other Africans. That's one of the ways we know that we came from Africa. The lack of genetic diversity outside Africa shows that everyone outside that continent is descended from one of the small groups that left. The answer is actually rather simple, if depressing. As Europeans in the New World demanded a working population to exploit the natural resources of their newly acquired lands, the African slave trade began to answer that call. Since Europeans had lost the institution of slavery in late antiquity, they didn't have what historians call an idiom of power. The idiom of power is the set of justifications which allow people to hold other people as property without believing the obvious truth that that is inherently immoral. Europeans therefore developed a new idiom of power, separating themselves from the, quote, Negro race. They were also sometimes referred to biblically as the sons of Ham, who God had cursed to always be slaves. Sub-Saharan Africans became a savage group whom it was morally justifiable to own as property. So one can insist on using the word black to refer exclusively to Sub-Saharan African populations, but an historian,
I'm an historian,
knows that doing so is reinforcing an idiom that was created to allow European colonizers to dominate and enslave people of colour. In the more recent past, the Pan-African movement has tried to reclaim the word black to refer to all African people of colour all over the world. This seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Given the socially constructed nature of race, I think it's fair to allow groups to self-identify their ethnicity.
When you say black in Britain, you mean sub-Saharan African. And this man, Cheddaman, had no sub-Saharan African DNA at all. He was not related to sub-Saharan Africans. It is a complete lie to say that he is. It's completely fictional.
I'm starting to get the impression that Rowsell doesn't believe that we all came from Africa. It seems difficult to believe that one could reach a master's in history without picking this knowledge up from somewhere. But again, I'm not going to say he's lying here, but he is, at best, deeply confused about human prehistory.
Skipping forward 8,000 years or so, probably couldn't find any people they could claim were black during that massive period.
Maybe, although if so, they weren't looking very hard. Dr. Caitlin Green of the University of Oxford has published an analysis of 79 burial sites in Bronze Age Britain. Of those, around 20% had evidence for at least one individual whose stable isotopes were consistent with a youth in North Africa, and around 11% of those have levels which would locate their youth specifically in the region of the Nile. So yeah, there were definitely African people living in Britain in the Bronze Age. I suspect they skipped time because it's a short song and you couldn't include every single example of a black person who lived in Britain in the past.
Next, we come to the period of the Roman occupation of Britain, and they bring up Emperor Septimius Severus as an example of a black man.
In a brilliant bit of subliminal messaging here, Rowsell puts up a white marble sculpture of Septimius Severus. I mean, it is obviously not reflective of a person's ethnicity, what material their sculpture is made from. But do you think it would have put a different picture in his audience's mind had he put up this black marble sculpture? Tell you what, let's say we had a contemporary portrait of Severus which showed him with dark skin. What kind of picture do you think that would leave in his audience's mind? This one, for example. This is the so-called Severan Tondo from around 200, i.e. during Severus's rule. It shows Julia Domna, Septimius Severus, and their two sons Caracalla and Geta. By the way, before you ask, no, we're not sure which of the two sons has had their face scratched off. This is a spectacularly famous artwork, which is literally used in the Horrible History song, but Rowsell carefully chose to use a brilliantly cleaned white marble sculpture instead. I say cleaned, by the way, because we know that generally white marble sculptures like this were painted in antiquity, so they wouldn't have been white. This is all stuff that an historian should know, or would find it triflingly easy to discover. I find this to be highly deceptive. Anyway, just as a sort of experiment, I'm going to leave this image up instead of Rowsell's face, just so we can think about it while we're listening to what he has to say.
Although he was not a black man at all. He was about probably half Roman, which is basically Italian.
So Severus's mother, Fulvia Pia, was a member of the Fulvia clan from Tusculum in Latium. Worth noting that no, a Latin, as in a person from Latium, the area around Rome, is not basically Italian. At the time, these were different things. I only bring this up to point out that ancient people did not think about ethnicity the same way we do. The Romans did not consider themselves to be the same ethnicity as the other Italians. If you go down to Naples, for example, the famous city of Pompeii, that had actually been an Oscan city, a southern Italian culture with their own language, alphabet and culture. Same if you just popped across the Apennines from Rome, you'd come across the Umbrians and the Samnites. If you went north towards modern Pisa, you'd come across the Etruscans. These were not Romans. They were considered to be ethnically distinct. Ethnicity, as the ancients viewed it, was a far more local affair than we tend to conceptualize it in the modern world, and it had absolutely nothing to do with skin colour. However, the bigger problem is that we have no idea when Fulvia's family came to North Africa. Roman merchants started moving to Leptis Magna, where Severus grew up, pretty much straight after the Punic Wars in the 2nd century BCE. If Fulvia's family had moved sometime around the turn of the 1st century, they could have been living in North Africa and mixing with the local population for 300 years.
And half North African, which means not black.
Severus's father, Publius Septimius Geta, was from a Punic family. The Phoenicians had taken over Leptis at some point in the 7th century, and it had been a major centre in the Carthaginian Empire. Again, we have no idea when Geta's family moved to Leptis, but they could have been living there and mixing with the African population for almost 1,000 years.
North Africans today are not black, of course. They're of West Eurasian origin. Some of them have Arab DNA, but even before the Arab expansion into North Africa, the overall population of North Africa was of West Eurasian descent. That means it comes from the Middle East and Europe.
Yeah, definitely not Europe. So the genetic profile of North Africa is incredibly diverse, making up an almost bewildering patchwork of different haplotypes. Now, there are actually some autochthonous West African genetics present, in Western North Africa particularly, that is, populations who moved from East Africa to Western Sub-Saharan Africa before going north across the Western Sahara. This happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, so long ago that our oldest surviving Homo sapiens fossil is actually from Morocco. What Rowsell is talking about, however, are the Upper Paleolithic migrations across North Africa. So we've already mentioned that humans left East Africa about 70 to 60,000 years ago and went north. Well, initially they expanded into the Levant, that's the modern Middle East. Now, then what happened about 10 to 20,000 years later, about 50 to 40,000 years ago, is that some of those people moved back across the Sinai and spread across the coast of North Africa. And it is true that a large amount of the ancient DNA of North Africa comes from these people who moved from East Africa to the Levant and then back across North Africa. Just to be absolutely clear, these would all have been dark-skinned peoples, indistinguishable from sub-Saharan Africans. The genes for lighter skin developed as a reaction to our movement north, first appearing around 22 to 28,000 years ago.
The population of North Africa today is not called black. However, they often have little bits of black DNA because the Muslims, during the Muslim period, in medieval times, the Muslims enslaved black people and sometimes interbred with them. And so sometimes you'll find like residual black admixture, sometimes 5 or even 10% black admixture in North Africans today, but we still don't call them black.
Why is any of this relevant? The ethnicity of modern Libya is of no relevance to the ethnicity of a 2nd century Roman in Lepcis Magna. Other than reiterating Rowsell's insistence on using a colonial use of racial terms, all of this is misdirection. Look, modern North Africans have quite pale skin. Draw your own conclusions, racially primed audience.
But before that, in the Roman period, when we're talking about now, there was no black admixture in these people.
Lepcis Magna existed because it was a Mediterranean port from which it was comparatively easy to trade with the African interior. That's literally why it was important, both to the Carthaginians and the Romans. You're expecting me to believe a place that existed due to it being a connection point between the African interior and the Mediterranean had no sub-Saharan African influence. Okay.
They weren't black at all. Septimius Severus had no black ancestry, and in fact, there's a story about him, possibly apocryphal, but it's still very revealing, about when he encounters an Ethiopian Roman soldier. Ethiopian didn't just mean from Ethiopia, it just means black. Ethiopia means burned skin in Greek, basically. So it's what they called all black people. And the soldier spooks Septimius Severus so much that he thinks it's a bad omen seeing such dark skin. So not only was Septimius Severus not a black man, he was actually racist against black people.
Okay, so Rowsell isn't going to give a reference for this, but it comes from the Historia Augusta. This is an account that spuriously claims to be a collective work from the turn of the 3rd, 4th century, though scholars are pretty unanimous in agreeing that it was the work of a single author around the turn of the 4th, 5th century. So this is a book written 200 years after the events it claims to be reporting. It gives us no idea where this story came from. The Historia Augusta, by the way, isn't shy about telling us when it's getting something from an imperial letter or other document. It doesn't do that here, but it does expect us to believe that a North African brought up in Lepcis Magna thought the sight of a black person was an omen of death. Remember,
I'm an historian.
He's an historian, but the most basic interrogation of this source reveals that it's suspect. Thus, he is lying. However, even if we take this story seriously, then it's a story about a sub-Saharan African in Britain. However you cut it, whether this story is true or not, it's not good for your argument here, buddy. And this is the first point I want to point out, that Rowsell is taking his audience for idiots. Using a story about a sub-Saharan African in Roman Britain to prove there were no sub-Saharan Africans in Roman Britain. Rowsell thinks his audience are stupid and he treats them as such.
The next false claim they make is also in the Roman era, and it concerns about 300 Maori soldiers or Maori soldiers serving under Aurelius. The man singing the song refers to them as the brave Aurelian Moors. The Moor is an English word that derives from the old Latin word Mori, which is what they referred to North African people, basically the same as modern day Berbers. Berbers are not black. Some Berbers today do have a sub-Saharan African admixture for the aforementioned reason with the contact during the Islamic slave trade.
Hey, do you know who else Berbers took slaves from during the period of the Islamic slave trade? Northern Europe. Barbary raids were so common across the British and Irish coast that in the 1640s a committee was set up to ransom back the estimated 5,000 to 6,000 British slaves held in Algiers alone. So, when I see a picture of a ginger dude dressed as a Berber, I don't think, hey, that's weird, ginger is a really rare genetic type. I think that's the descendant of an enslaved Irishman or Icelander or Dutchman. Berbers aren't generally white dudes with ginger beards. Again, Rowsell is trying to mislead his audience here. The image on the right, by the way, is from the tomb of Seti I in the 13th century BCE. It's difficult not to be annoyed by Rowsell's insistence on using images that are from well over 1,000 years before or after the time he's talking about, when contemporary images exist. It's almost like he's trying to trick his audience into believing something he knows isn't true.
The Moors back in those days, or rather Maori, did not have any black admixture. They were not black people. They were Berbers. So again, it's completely wrong to call them black. Black means sub-Saharan Africans. Berbers are not white people, but it would be more accurate to call them white people than to call them black people because they're genetically more related to white people than they are to black people. So if it would be dishonest to refer to the Berbers as white, it's even more dishonest to refer to them as black.
Now, I'm not a geneticist, I freely admit that, but I can't find anything at all, anywhere, that would support Rowsell's claims here. Note he cites no evidence whatsoever to support this assertion. Given his current relationship with the truth, I'm going to go with Hitchens' razor, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I can't believe I've only covered 5.5 minutes of this video. He's just so wrong in so many ways that it would be trivial for an historian to check. The fact that he either hasn't bothered to check means either A, he's lying about being an historian and lying about his qualifications on his LinkedIn, or B, he's lying about everything else. Now, impressively, in the second half of this video, his lies become even more brazen and his comments even more overtly racist. If you'd like to see me torture myself by going back to it, please tell me below. I'm off to scrub my brain clean with strong alcohol. I've been Epic Treatise. Goodbye.